Thank you for that introduction. Thank you all for having me to your lunch event. We're about halfway through the year here at IAS. It's been incredible for me as a scholar, and I've spent my career studying credit institutions in the United States. And one of the things that's happened here at IAS is I'm surrounded by scholars who are studying the economy around the world. And what it means is that they're constantly asking me questions and providing me other contexts and pushing me to think further in ways that are deeply widening my own knowledge and the kind of questions that I ask. And while I continue to investigate the United States, I'm already aware that kind of from halfway through the year here, the kind of questions I'll be asking throughout my whole career have already been kind of indelibly changed by this experience. So while I'm going to talk about the United States today, I'm happy in the Q&A to talk more broadly about some of how I'm thinking about the international context. So the title of today's talk is Credit from the State, Credit to the State. I'm being a little ambitious about how much material I can probably get through in a half hour, so we might spend more time on the from the state and than the to the state part, but we'll see. I always try to aim big. So today I'm going to talk about this moment, or the lead up to this moment. And this is Woodrow Wilson signing the Federal Farm Loan Act of 1916. And what I want you to know right away is I promise you that is not as boring as it seems. Right? There's a lot of reasons why we might be interested in this moment. And the core reason that I'm interested in this moment is this is what's considered the first modern federal credit program. And federal credit programs, I believe, are the most important policy tool that most people never think about. Today, the US government, so federal credit programs are the kind of programs within the government that buy, sell, insure, or guarantee loans. They work to kind of move credit around to different industries, different parts of the country, different groups. They're a kind of multi-purpose policy tool, and I'll explain what I mean by that as I talk more. Today, the US government owns $3.8 trillion worth of loans. Most of this comes from, owns or guarantees $3.8 trillion. Most of the $1.3 trillion of loans it owns are school loans. And most of the $2.5 trillion guaranteed loans are housing, are guarantees for mortgages. The FHA is the #1 mortgage insurer in the world. If we actually include off-budget numbers, we get to $8.5 trillion. So if we're including like Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac, which are currently under conservatorship by the government, but not officially considered owned by the government, we get to $8.5 trillion. And if we actually look kind of even more broadly, in terms of contingent liabilities, of like how much the US federal government might be on the hook, especially in a time of crisis, we can think about 2009, and this Sergeant Inspector General of TARP is testifying to Congress about how much the US government would be on the hook in a worst case scenario. And the answer was $27.5 trillion in a worst case scenario. It was 150% of GDP that year. Right? So this kind of facilities of the government that guarantee loans in other ways are doing significant work, kind of can fluctuate a great deal. And a point that I'm going to make, kind of flesh out later, is they can really matter not just for the total amount of money spent or guaranteed, but they can matter for the way they help build institutions, build technologies, kind of provide breakthroughs in markets. So most people, when you're thinking of federal credit programs, you're probably going to think of FHA or the VA, which famously insure guaranteed loans. The Small Business Administration offers loans. But loans, I also want to point out that loans can kind of serve other functions. Loans can be a form of foreign policy. So in 2017, the US government guaranteed $1 billion of issuances from the government of Iraq. Loans can be a form of kind of developmental policy. The USAID issues loans. So loans can be a form of military policy and economic development. The Atomic Energy Commission relied on guarantees to help pull money into atomic development. So there's a kind of a long, multifaceted history of the ways loans get used throughout the economy. And so while loans are kind of centrally organized around housing and school loans, there's a much kind of deeper history. And there's really almost no part of the economy that hasn't been affected by government federal credit loan programs in one way or another. So yeah, a reminder that USAID provides loans. FEMA actually uses loans. Loans can be a form of social policy. FEMA uses loans for mortgages to help repair and rebuild areas. The Commodity Credit Corporation, which is involved in price subsidy, actually uses loans as a way to organize price subsidies. So they do a lot of things that people wouldn't necessarily think about. So when I'm doing this research on the federal credit programs and interested in where our federal credit programs came from and why we have our first federal program, I want to acknowledge that I'm stepping into a much larger debate that's been happening across academic disciplines about the role of credit in the US political economy. Now, a lot of people, that literature has kind of exploded since 2008 as a result of the crisis, as people have kind of grappling with housing credit and credit markets and their expansion around the world. But I want to point out that there's just really briefly, there's a couple of other debates that I'm stepping into as well. One has to do with US social policy. Americans have long relied on credit to meet needs that tend to be socially provisioned other places. So the housing wealth becomes a font of money for healthcare that families tap to cover healthcare costs, for example, or education costs. And we can see roots of this early in the 20th century. So there's scholars who've talked about what kind of early expansion of US credit in lieu of how welfare states work in other areas. And there's also a debate that's been kind of developing about a hidden state and a large US developmental state. Acknowledging while the US government had never had a central planning role in the economy the way you would see in Japan or you would see in France, that doesn't mean that there weren't significant kind of other ways that the government was intervening in the economy that were a lot more proactive than people realize, that go far beyond just setting regulations. That in fact, it often works through things like brokerage and organizations, military development, things like DARPA. So my goal in doing some of this research is to kind of put credit into these debates. A lot of this scholarship has been going on for a long time, but not necessarily talking about the role of these credit programs in it. So what I'm going to talk about today is a kind of the thread of the scholarship, which talks about how and why credit allocation became this widely used tool of statecraft in the United States, even before the financial turn. And hopefully what that discussion what I just discussed shows is that what I'm really fundamentally interested is the intersection of the state and the economy. And that I think credit is an exceptionally good place for us to understand more and to push our understanding of the role the government actually plays in the economy, the full nature of that role, but also the social, the kind of mechanisms and forces behind it that are structuring the way that that plays out. And more, and frequently in my work, a lot of the work that I'm doing here is about trying to understand the consequences of this. For example, for things like why Americans don't really understand what the government does. So this gets me to the kind of the federal credit programs. And I'll say quickly that I'm going to focus on the internal dynamics from the state. None of what I mean to imply here is that private firms don't matter for credit allocation or that they don't influence government policy. But my goal, and I'm happy to answer kind of questions about the way private firms matter more, but my goal here is to talk about a part of the story that I think often falls to the wayside and that we don't know enough about, which is these internal dynamics of the government. And I'm really talking about just the United States. All right, so to the federal credit program. I wanted to understand what's about to happen in 1916 and why it's so interesting. It's important to first know a few things about what was going on in the 19th century as relates to credit allocation and farm credit. Now, people sometimes think of housing, maybe not so many people in this room, but people sometimes think of housing as this like font of stability in US life that was kind of chugging along very reliably until the economic crisis came in and messed everything up. And that is completely wrong. That is based on a set of kind of highly carefully regulated markets in the post-war era. And when you take a longer look at the history of property ownership and recognize that it's not just about housing, but once you're in the 19th century, you're really talking about farms and mortgages for farms, what you see is a much longer history of instability. There's always been a problem in the United States as it developed through westward expansion, which is that the capital was held on the East Coast, and they had to figure out how to get that capital expanded across a large, sparsely populated geographic frontier in any kind of reliable way. And that's no small problem. Moving credit under any circumstances can be hard, right? A mortgage involves a lot of risk, right? The risk of that the person will default, possible changing value in the land. Farm mortgage, you have to count on the fact of what's going to happen with international commodity markets. Maybe there's going to be a big boom of cotton production in Egypt that's going to drive down the value of cotton sales and undermine the businesses of farmers in the US. Or what if there's bad weather? Or what if there's pestilence? There's a lot of risks. So managing those risks were hard. It doesn't mean that credit never flowed westward, but it flowed westwards in these really destabilizing booms and busts. So you would get a flood of credit as a business cycle would heat up because the big business was farming. Money would flow into these kind of local mortgage markets. It would build up local property values, lots of fraud, lots of expansion, credit bubble, and then it would crash. There were these painful contractions that were happening over time. So what that meant, these are census numbers from 1890, when we know that about a third of kind of mortgages, or a third of farms are mortgaged to about 50%, is that farmers on an East Coast could have a 10-year-long mortgage for 5.6%, but as you moved kind of into the periphery, further south and further west, the terms got harsher, the time you had to repay got shorter, and the interest rate you paid went up. Farmers knew this and were angry about it. But they couldn't, it was a problem that demanded a national level solution, right? A state in the West couldn't regulate the flow of credit into that state. And for a lot of reasons, because the kind of national government wasn't able to coordinate that flow of credit. There were a lot of people who thought that it was a dangerous form of government overreach to provide credit for people or to get involved in the credit system in any way. It was paternalistic, right? That any way the government would get involved in credit might mean that would help elites and be corrupting. So not everybody thought this. There were always people kind of arguing for different alternatives, but the people who thought it were kind of strong enough to be able to stop anything from happening. So farm credit in the 19th century was very unstable. It was highly, highly contentious. Farmers, especially in the West, were incredibly angry about it. There were a lot of problems with it. To save time, I'm going to skip through some of this. So one of the questions I had as I was doing my research is, how did we get from there to this like $8.5 trillion world of credit allocation we have today, right? How did Americans learn to stop worrying and love credit allocation? The secret to that is in the Farm Loan Act, and what happened in the Farm Loan Act can actually tell us a lot about how we're using credit today. For a lot of reasons that would kind of take too long to get into, the farmers' movements actually never solved this problem of credit allocation. But in the progressive era, in the early 20th century, progressive reformers started cluing into this problem. They were worried about the decline of the heartland. And as they researched what was going on that was devastating farm communities, they realized that access to credit was a core part of the problem. And like good progressives, they went around the world looking for a solution. So it was typical. There's this kind of magisterial book by this historian Daniel Rogers called Atlantic Crossings, about these commissions and these groups of progressives that would go around the world in the US, kind of building American political and market institutions. And in Atlantic Crossings, Rogers calls the commissions that went to look at credit the most extraordinary of the era. 125 Americans tour Europe. Their progress is reported in the New York Times as they move through. They go south to Egypt. They go as far north they go into Scandinavia. Actually, in Norway, they accidentally get sent to a slaughterhouse. And they reported back that while they were very surprised, that it was remarkably clean. So they're touring around the world looking at all aspects related to farming, and especially farming credit. And as they leave, they're very aware that, this is a quote from one of the main organizers, they're very aware that they're going to try to find this problem with, they're going to try to solve this problem with credit without having paternalism and overreach and too much government spending. Sorry, I realize that my clock is looking funny. Can you let me know when I have? All right, thank you. Sorry, usually I try to keep time myself. So this is the map from the kind of report they do. And I previewed. There's a little preview. They get to Germany. And Germany has what is at that point the gold standard of long-term farm credit systems in the world. In 1913, a German farmer can borrow can borrow like 80% of their land and have 45 to 50 years to pay it off. And it's amortized. None of that. In the US, you're lucky if you have 10 years. They're not using amortization. There's kind of crippling balloon payments at the end. In Germany, they're told that Germany has risen to agricultural prominence, not because of the quality of their soil, but because of the quality of their credit institutions. And they figured out this national system of organized land banks, and I don't want to get too much into the details of the system because of time constraints, but I want to say is there's a few important things about the system. One, it's organized nationally. Two, it's very carefully regulated. So now we see, when the Americans are abroad, they're told, these are reports, these are direct quotes from speeches they're given, the Germans prefer to sleep well rather than eat well. That the whole system is free from every tendency towards profit making. The system issues bonds that have a very unsexy 3 to 4% return. Right? It's to be a part of the system, you have to have, your property has to have 3 separate appraisals, the lowest of which will be taken. And there's somebody overlooking the system, and if they don't like those appraisals, they can call for another in. It's all reviewed through the local bureaucracy. It's a great system. The Germans warn the Americans, your government is not organized well enough to do this. You have a spoils system, right? You're not going to be able to do it. The Americans are not worried about that at all. What they're worried about is that part of these systems involves people sharing risks with each other. And they don't think the American national culture is such that Americans are be willing to share each other's risks. There's another thing that happens on this trip. In addition to kind of learning the details of how to organize such a system, what they hear again and again, country after country, is that credit provision is a way for governments to help people help themselves. In fact, by providing access to credit, the government is improving self-help. It's not paternalism. And this idea is going to come up again and again in times after it. Here's a quote from kind of a report of Americans who came back. Our farm property is computed to be worth $40 billion. Surely this vast property, whose value is as stable as the foundations of our government, is sufficient to attract capital in ample volume to improve and cultivate its area without subvention from the government treasury. The idea of federal aid is always attractive and commands many able and earnest advocates, but self-help should be the motto of our new agriculture. If given opportunity under a liberal enactment of law, the savings of our nation will gladly invest in this safe field. You can argue how safe and mortgage investments are. The savings of our nation will gladly invest in the safe field and relieve the federal treasury of any necessity to finance the project. It is wise legislation rather than liberal appropriations or loans, which rural credit mostly needs at our hands. There's a couple things I want to point out about this. First is we see this like self-help motto. You still hear that being talked about today. If you read the federal budget today, credit supplement, on the first 3 paragraphs, it will say this is about self-help. The other thing I want to point out is what they're starting to figure out is that credit is a very effective way to govern. And if they can get investors to move capital to where they want it, they don't have to tax and spend. That the federal treasury's role can be very low. Right? If they do this the right way, they can relieve the federal treasury of any necessity to finance the project. This is the idea I'm going to return to. So, it's okay if it's a little kind of rough around the edges right now. There's years of kind of back and forth and fighting about what this legislation could look like. And the actual legislation sets up a system of joint stock banks that totally failed during the Depression. And it also set up the farm loan system that we have in existence today. Following, in some ways, the model of the Federal Reserve, the nation is divided into 12 areas, each of which has their own bank. I'm going to use Texas as the example of how this works because Texas is its own area. So a land bank, which is first upfront capitalized from the Treasury and is allowed to issue tax-exempt bonds, is going to lend money to local federal loan associations that then lend money to farmers. As farmers as farmers take loans, they have to kind of subscribe to the FLAs into their local land bank, and this is going to recapitalize the system. Farmers do this in 1947, but then need to be bailed out again later. Here's the thing. None of this exists. These farm loan associations do not exist. It's as if the Federal Reserve had decided that what was best for the nation was to only work with banks that were cooperatives and then go about incentivizing the creation of those cooperatives. To do this, the government embarks on a massive educational campaign, explaining to farmers how and why they should organize this. As part of that campaign, the system requires the use of long-term amortizing mortgages, which are not used. These pamphlets are explaining what the new mortgages will look like and why they're a good idea. They sometimes use these overblown language. This is a quote from one that says that it may be the greatest blessing the farming world has ever had bestowed on it since the passage of the Homestead Acts. And they kind of generate all these examples. So it had a slow start for a couple of years. It was kind of contested in a court case that went up to the Supreme Court. But within 10 years, there were 6,000 of these kind of organizations existing. So this was a real turning point in the use of credit allocation in the United States, and importantly, I argue, in the framing of credit. It is now socially acceptable for the government to issue credit to people as a form of self-help. And because it's a form of self-help, the fact that the United States government has completely rebuilt the entire system of farm finance, the foundation for the nation's biggest industry, from the ground up, is considered a mere technical series of tweaks that don't necessarily interfere with the autonomy, entrepreneurship, individualism, and the importance of all the work being done by the individual. Right? They've managed to thread this needle, this very powerful way. So you can have extensive government action in ways that don't interfere with anybody's individual sense that they've done it themselves. The farm loan system immediately becomes the model for a series of intermediate credit banks, for banks for the savings and loans, which are called the banks for cooperatives, later the housing system. And in the New Deal, we get an explosion of the use of credit as a tool of statecraft. Under the New Deal, the Reconstruction Finance Corporation is going to massively expand how all of this is used. The housing programs are going to become the center of the post-war economy. And we actually have quotes from Mariner Eccles talking about how FDR makes this decision, that he realizes that credit can be the wheel within the wheel to move the entire economy. That by issuing support and insurance for mortgages, they can increase the new home building. Right? New home building is the #1 employee in the country at that point. Right? It's a major, and right, it's a jobs program. Right? Credit support is a jobs program. And not only that, but it helps all the industries that then feed into housing. Right? So everything that will go into all the materials, everything that will go into the house, the curtains, the china, and then also the cars that will be used to go to and from the houses, and the railways that are going to carry all of these materials back and forth. But because it's an insurance program, it's going to cost almost nothing. Okay? By the post-war era, the US government is using kind of regulations on these different insurance programs to totally control the temperature of the entire economy, to use housing as the mechanism where it's going to kind of speed things up or slow things down. Wheel within the wheel. And they can do it all without costing a lot of money. So here, then, is what they figured out by the end of the New Deal, that credit has capacities that make it very useful as a political tool. I call these the kind of lightness of credit. Ideologically, it looks like a market form, right? It's kind of ambiguous. It can often involve private companies. It involves a loan. So somebody can get a massive boost up from the government, but feel like they just earned it through the market themselves. It appeals across the left and the right. This is not a policy from one political side or another. Everybody does this. Fiscally, it can have a huge payoff for relatively low outlays. Guaranteed, the US government doesn't modernize accounting for these programs till 1992. There was no capital budget in the US at all until 1992. All of these programs are calculated in ways that are rife with budget gimmickry. Sometimes they are entirely off book. They're used to set up these revolving funds. Accounting-wise, it's a mess. It's part of why we don't. Well, I've relied so much on case studies. I've been putting together better historical records of it because the accounting's so bad on these. To go back and figure out what happened basically requires extensive forensic accounting. Budgetary, in terms of the budget process, because it can be set off budget, they can avoid all these veto points that shut down other programs. Right? So there's a huge amount of flexibility with the budgeting. And racially, at times when other kinds of programs, like in the New Deal, are running into racial animus, right? When you have the Southern Democrats and the New Deal kind of stopping any program that they think is going to upend Southern racial hierarchies, they have no problem using the credit programs. Because credit programs actually tend to reproduce the status quo, including the racial status quo. So I talk about this as a capacity for political lightness. And this is what makes credit so popular as a multifaceted political tool. And one of the consequences of it is it creates incentives to start defining all sorts of problems as a credit problem. So say you're a government official and there's demands for more access to higher education. What do you want to do? Do you want to tax people and use that money to build schools, state schools? Or do you want to create a loan program and have families take out those loans themselves? Right? Through the post-war era, the loan programs grow, guarantees start displacing direct loan programs because at that time they are entirely off budget. This is from the 2019 federal budget. It's continued to grow. I mentioned at the beginning that this is not just about how much money the government is insuring, but also the other innovations that are happening in these programs. The early venture capital industry is a small niche industry, and the Small Business Administration plays an important role in its expansion through small business investment corporations that are guaranteed by the government. They're not that successful, but we have reports from people in the industry that it kind of trained a generation of people who would go on to build other companies. Export-Import Bank is the first group in the United States that guarantees small, mid-sized business loans abroad. It was considered too dangerous and was not done until Export-Import Bank shows that it can be done, and then private companies follow. The long-term amortized mortgage is being used very rarely until you have the farm loan associations and the home associations doing it. And a lot of my other work has looked at the history of securitization, which was a failed attempt in the 1960s until the US government, through Fannie Mae, gets massively involved in making sure that it succeeds as a business. All of this has implications for the developmental state, for inequality, I have more time than I thought, for inequality, for levels of household debt, for transparency and coordination and control of the government, for financial power, and also for things like economic instability and crisis. In my time left, I want to talk about the part of this that really is at the heart of my new research, which is how Americans understand themselves and how Americans understand what the state is and what the government is. There's been a revolution in kind of history, political science, and sociology, and understanding the extensive ways that the government is involved in everyday life and in the economy. But there's a huge gap between what people understand the government does, thinks the government does, and what the government's actually doing. And there's a lot of debates about how we can account for that. Now, credit programs are a really good case for thinking through a lot of these debates. And we have clues about why in other work that people have done. David Freund is a historian at University of Maryland. His work, Colored Property, talks about how in the post-war era, he looks essentially at Detroit, white families especially were invested in making sure that the housing programs were always discussed as market tweaks. So that even if the federal government was like totally underscoring the entire and watching and carefully managing the entire post-war housing market, which it was, it's seen as just a tweak to the market. And as a result, right, as housing becomes the center of wealth for the average American family. So most middle-class families that have wealth, their wealth is actually entirely in their home. And that market was entirely supported by the federal credit programs. Remember how I said FHA was the #1 mortgage insurer in the world? Those programs would not guarantee the homes in neighborhoods that were racially integrated. It had a model of property value that valuable property was white neighborhoods. This was redlining. And so at the time when you have this massive increase in wealth for the average family, and a reorganization of where and how people live, an organization that's going to matter for where people's kids go to school, and who lives in your neighborhood and what social networks you have, families of color are put out of that market. But the white families who are living through this are experiencing this not as having anything to do with the government helping make sure that they have access to credit and excluding other people's access to credit. They just see it as the result of their own hard work. And of course, they are working hard, right? Even if you have government support for your mortgage, you're still struggling to meet your mortgage. You don't necessarily notice all the help you're getting from the government through a lower interest rate or a better chance to default or kind of access to a loan that you might not have gotten otherwise. Chloe Thurston, who's actually here right now, has written about actually black activists were aware of this from the beginning and were aware and fighting for inclusion in these programs from the beginning. So this question of who sees the state and who doesn't see the state is totally sociologically patterned. So the credit programs, what I'm looking at now is how the structure of the loan itself makes it easier or harder for people to understand how they interact with the government and who gets attribution for success. Now, this is not just about housing. And not just about credit. We can think about this in terms of other kinds of programs too. So this is a slide from economist Mariana Mazzucato, her book, The Entrepreneurial State, which points out that every major technology in the iPhone was at one point or another supported by some kind of government research initiative. Every single one. But if you ask Americans who's responsible for these innovative breakthroughs, you wouldn't say that we kind of collectively all put in the effort to make sure this happened. And in fact, her work is about showing how it is always the kind of risks needed for these breakthroughs are so big that no private company can do it. You need governments to do this. But in America, especially, the government doesn't like to take credit for that. So this is what I mean about credit to the state, right? I'm going to go back to credit. This is a slide. This slide is taken from a web page from the White House's transportation program. The current administration has kind of argued that it can turn $100 billion investment into kind of $1 trillion of infrastructure development. Part of how you do that is through government guarantees and credit guarantees. And in fact, you see this kind of language that has deep echoes in the past, that this is about unleashing private sector capital and expertise to rebuild our cities and states. But when that is unleashed with a guarantee program, what's happening is that actually all the risks are socialized. So sometimes talked about as like lemon socialism, right? All the risks and downsides stay with taxpayers, and all the profits go to the private companies. And yet we keep on turning to it. The political usefulness of credit, the ideological and fiscal lightness, the more polarized the political system is, the more important tools like these are as a way to work around the divides. The more important that something that can reach across these divides are and avoid budget veto points are. And so the seductions of credit still remain. So this is where I will leave us with the summary that credit has qualities of political lightness that make allocation a popular, multi-purpose policy tool. And they're doing it when you're talking about avoiding the fiscal demands and doing it with the budget. What we're talking about is trying to avoid taxing and spending. And that means we're avoiding wealth distribution. Okay? So it is the promise of being able to have growth for everybody with minimal sacrifices involved. Okay, thank you.